Okay, welcome back everybody. Just an FYI for all of you, for Dr. Lee's first half. That exercise, those of you that are online that you saw us do in class, that's downloadable for all of you in DocShare in each of the 3 sections. So as you start working on that, you can find that exercise and you can print it out yourselves to do that, okay? All right, so Dr. Lee did the first half, which was the Larson-Freeman, and now we're going to have a look at the related form focus chapter of the Brown, okay? So form focus instruction has changed over time, right? And we just saw the classical method, which was, when it first started, was super classical, right? You actually translated things from the canon, from the literary canon. I wouldn't exactly call Wikipedia the literary canon, so even GTM has moved like a little bit further on and done that. But when I started teaching, we would use a book like this. This is a very famous book by a very famous author. Her name is Betty Azar. How many of you in your, Sandy, you did Betty?
I knew her version, but still.
Yeah, no, Betty Azar's up and running. Now, this is one of the versions I used back in the 1980s. But it's still going sort of pretty much full on. So the idea of form-focused instruction was literally form-focused instruction. So let's imagine that we're the curriculum is a form-focused curriculum. So the subjects that you choose are based on form, right? The students move forward in class through forms. That's how they, not through functions, but through forms. So let's imagine that we have now hit, we're in an intermediate class and we've now hit passive voice, okay? So here's how well you can see this. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this would be your chapter, the passive. And literally what she's teaching you is how do you form the passive, right? So you have an active tense, Mary helped the boy. And if you did it in a passive tense, the boy was helped by Mary, okay? So the form of the passive be plus the participle, past participle, object of active verb becomes subject of passive verb. And she points out that you can only do that, in fact, with transitive verbs, right? So then you get all these really helpful. So simple present goes to is helped, present progressive is being helped, etc., all the way through. And then you get to the really jolly fun part, which is, which is pages and pages of fill in the blank, right? So exercise number 1, change the passive, active to the passive. So Tom opens the door becomes the door is opened by Tom, okay? Tom is opening the door, comes the door is being opened by Tom, right? And so we go on and on and on. And then in this case, we have sentences change the active to the passive. Shakespeare wrote the play. The play was written by Shakespeare, right? This goes on and on and on and on. Like there's just pages and pages of these kinds of exercises, right? And that's what the students do. So when you talk about form-focused instruction, we really meant form-focused instruction, right? What's sort of missing from this, would you say? Based on your reading or your own experience? Okay, good. One huge thing that's missing here is use, right? Like, it's all very nice to say the door is opened by Tom. Why would you want to say that, right? Why is that something that someone at some time might want to say, right? Yeah. Why is that important for the language learner?
It wouldn't be unless you're trying to learn the higher academic level writing, where grammar and structure is more important than.
Yes, it's true that in academic English for academic purpose, grammar and structure is really important. But isn't it also true that you would need to know in reading and writing why you wanted to suddenly start randomly using the passive tense?
Yes.
Right? Right? So why in my paper am I suddenly using the passive tense correctly or incorrectly? Right? Yeah. So that's really the real issue. Because what happens if you don't know the answer to that question? If you're a learner or a teacher and you don't know the answer to the question why, what happens to your learner?
They get lost.
Yeah, they get lost, they get confused, they then have a piece of language sitting in their language inventory, they have no idea why it's there. They have no idea whether they're supposed to use it or not. When they do use it, you can almost guarantee they use it incorrectly. Or some happy teacher from the English department will write, never use the passive tense. Oh, why did they teach me the passive tense? Because of course that's not true. You do need to use the passive tense sometimes, but for certain things. Okay. So both you as a learner, if you're an English language learner, you want to know how I use the passive. I keep calling it tense. It should be passive voice. And second, if you're a teacher, when your learners, when you give them an exercise like that, which I hope you don't, but if you did, or if they saw somewhere else, they would say, wow, Ms. Miller, why are we doing the passive voice? You would say, yeah, actually you should know because you did this last time around.
I wasn't prepared to be called on.
I'm teasing. No.
I mean, you have to explain you apply some kind of emphasis as part of the right.
Right. So you've got to know the reason is of course functional, not structural, which is the whole point. So if you have form-focused instruction, that's literally and only focused on the structure itself, you have no idea why you're bothering with it, right? Because its use is functional.
Yeah. But if you're really using the grammar, teaching it with the focus on the use of it, then there won't even be a need for the students to ask why we're using this because you presented the use of the grammar.
Precisely. Right. Well, that's why I said I don't want to see you use a textbook like this, but sometimes, I mean, I still have this in my library from 1988, so my guess is you'll be working at a school somewhere that will pop that up in its library. Okay. So instead, we don't want to talk about form-focused instruction in that way, meaning literally, specifically, and only a focus on structure. Okay. So what your book talked about was a new idea of form-focused instruction from the lovely Larson Freeman, who we just looked at in the first line, Larson Freeman, where she talked about form, meaning, and use. Do you remember that? So form-focused instruction is critical. Okay, we know that that's how you get from one level to another, and we certainly know that's how you become an advanced learner. But that doesn't mean the Betty Azar kind of form-focused instruction, right? What we like to think of now is more of this idea of form, meaning, and use. So I can find a piece of paper. I'm going to have a crack at doing a form, meaning, and use. So what do we mean when we say, so let's use the passive voice as an example. And what she does is take a circle and literally divide it into form, meaning, and use. Okay. So our form is the passive voice. So what goes in the form bit?
Regarding passive.
Yeah.
So subject verb.
Good. So everything we just read from the Bettiers are, right? So that the agent and the patient get switched around, you use the past participle, etc. That whole rule which I'm not going to repeat here. Okay. So that's the form part. Okay. What about the use part? Oh, sorry, wrong way around. I'm trying to go this way around because the use comes from the. What's the meaning part of passive voice?
Semantic meaning behind all those lexical things in the sentence. If you just, for example, provide us with a passive sentence, like what does that sentence mean? What is the difference between active and passive?
Well, right. What's the meaning of the passive voice?
Like the agent, the doer of
It
the
was
action
already
is not
done.
important.
Good. That the agent of the action is for some reason demoted. Okay. That's what the meaning is, right? So if you have an agent like Tom opened the door, right? I'm just checking if everyone can still see that. Here's your agent, and you change it to a passive. The door was opened by Tom. Your agent is now demoted. There you go. Your agent is now demoted into a by phrase, right? The important point becomes the door was opened. And in fact, it's so demotable, it's disappearable, right? If we decide we're really not interested in anything about who opened the door, we can just get rid of it. The door was opened. Okay, that's the important issue, right? So the meaning is that the agent, as it would appear in an active sentence, is demoted. Okay, why would we use such a structure? Why, under what circumstances, communicative circumstances, might you want to demote the agent?
When we don't know if we don't know him.
Okay, so one thing would be that we don't know who the agent is, right? What else?
I keep thinking of I don't want to say it though, but we know who the agent is, but they don't take the fault, the whole mistakes were made.
Yes, good. We know who the agent is, in fact, but whoever is expressing this doesn't want to discuss it, right? So we don't want to focus on the agent. Now, what the one that Shelby is talking about is the one from my history when you were all gleams in your parents' eyes, most of you, is mistakes were made, which was a statement made by Ronald Reagan when he was president, and it was about Nicaragua, not Nicaragua, the arms embargo or something. And he said, a journalist said, well, what went on? Who did who did what? Why did this happen? And he said, mistakes were made. Okay.
We made anything.
Yeah, right. And so, that way he doesn't, he says, yes, mistakes were made, but I'm taking no responsibility, for that. I'm not saying mistakes were made by me or by my government, which is obviously, of course, the case. And the third possibility would be,
Common sense.
good, when it's common sense, when there's no need to mention the agent. So for that case, you would have something like, here's the one I always use. Cars must be driven slowly up the ramp, right? So sometimes you'll see that or something like that. Okay, you're not going to say drivers must drive cars slowly up the ramp because it's obvious that it's a driver driving the car, right? So you don't need, although possibly less obvious once we have self-driving cars, but then it would be cars, you must drive yourself slowly up the ramp. But anyway, right now something like that just means you don't need, cars must be driven slowly up the ramp by the driver. It would be a complete waste of time. Okay, so this is what we mean now when we say form-focused instruction, right? We say what the form is itself. So that's that part. We still have that. We want to hold on to the structure. But now we also want to give our students the meaning, okay, what it means, what that structure means, and then why we would use it as well, okay? And you can pretty much do this with any slot, you know, any kind of thing that you decide to choose, okay? So, for example, we can do another quick example. I think I said articles. You can do another, so we do form, meaning, articles, the horrible bane of all second language learners in English. It's a nightmare, let's face it. Click delay, excellent. So let's just start with, let's just do and the, right? The, yeah, and zip, right? No zero, no article, right? Okay. So that's our forms, right? Forget all the other quantifiers and stuff at the moment. We're going to come back to that. So sorry, that should be the, and that, okay? And then we can talk about the fact that the difference between a and an is based on, right, vowel versus consonant, okay, in the next word, right? So, and that pretty much covers this on form. And if it was that easy, learners wouldn't struggle with it, right? So obviously it isn't that part that's the problem, right? Because that's pretty straightforward. So it's one of these parts that's the problem, right? So what's the meaning in general terms of these?
They identify something?
Okay, good. So they're identifiers, right? What else? Good, good. That things, it tells you whether things are countable, uncountable. What else? What's the difference between and the? Good. Definite versus indefinite, right? So we can already see, you know, this is pretty, you know, what does definite mean? What does indefinite mean? What is, you know, does it always mean the same thing? Well, no, it depends on the context that it appears in, right? So we can see that it's starting to get a tad more complicated. Now let's look at use. Can you give me some examples? Why would we use it? How do we use it? Ah, Shelby's had a light bulb moment.
Well, if you were going to go with the or verse a, like shared knowledge or not. Or
Good, good. Okay, so
we only had to learn that in 4 different classes to finally recall.
So should we take that as the goal, Shelby? That we mention one classically important concept in 4 different classes, and our students should walk out the door with those.
Knowing that concept, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so let's just take that. Let's take the I mean, there are others, but I don't want to be doing this for forever. So let's take the pragmatic use of articles, and that has to do with shared knowledge. What is shared knowledge, say you? Well, it depends on who you are and who you're sharing the knowledge with, okay? So shared knowledge, the example I always use to try and give you an idea of this is if you're coming to my house, right? So I'm giving you some, this is not actually true. Anybody out there who came to my house the other day, I know this is not true, but it's a good example. They would say, Lucy, you know, I know we've been to your house before, but I forget what I do after I get off 64. So I say, well, if you get off 64, you'll remember the bridge. You go under the bridge, right? And they say, oh, yeah, right, yeah, there's the bridge right there. Okay. And that's someone who's been to my house before. So I'm assuming that the bridge is shared knowledge, okay? But if it's someone says, okay, I've never been to your house before, what do I think I've got it up to 64, then what do? I say, well, as you come off 64, you'll see a bridge, okay? You want to go under that bridge and then go to the left, okay? My choice of or the in this particular context, the use in this context, doesn't have anything to do with grammar, okay? It doesn't have anything to do with this bit right here. It has to do with pragmatics, okay? The use of it, what I think you know and what I know, right? That's why the article system in English is such a nightmare. If it was just like, which is how, my bet is, I can almost guarantee this is how you were taught it, correct? With a whole focus on, you know, what the structure is, okay? If it was that easy, we'd all be doing super great. In fact, complication lies here, and most particularly here, because pragmatic context, as you know, changes depending upon the people in the interaction, the context, etc. Okay. So when we talk about form-focused instruction in the communicative method, we don't mean we abandon the whole idea of focusing on grammar. That would be a terrible, terrible plan, right? All the second language acquisition literature tells us that the probably the best way of learning is to simultaneously be part of a community and be in a classroom, okay? That if you're part of a community, so let's say you do a study abroad program, but then you spend your whole time hanging around with all your buddies and you never speak any English, whatever, then that's not going to help you. If you go on a study abroad program and you spend all your time speaking with your buddies, but you do some work in class, that will help you some. If you go to, the most helpful thing you can do is go on a study abroad, stop talking to your buddies, and sit inside a classroom. Because that way then you get the communicative focus and the form focus, and your language system is likely to improve on both. What we don't want is some kind of pigeon type language where, you know, me Tarzan, you Jack, right? Where nobody's using any kind of grammatical form that's, you know, understandable, or that we basically, our learners hit a ceiling, a glass ceiling. They can't go any further in their communication because their grammatical system simply isn't advanced enough for them to do that. You don't want that to happen. So form focus is very important, but it shouldn't look like Bessier's arm, right? It should look like loss and friction. Any questions about that? Okay. All right. So what this means is that as a teacher, you have to have some kind of credible content knowledge of what you're teaching. In other words, you have to have some significant understanding of English grammar. And really here I'm looking at my native speaker students in class, and I'm talking to my native speaker students online, because like me, you would probably never have done this. Okay? You've never done this in school. You've never had a focus on grammar. The only things you've talked about are that you should never use a passive tense, which is not even true, and that you shouldn't put a preposition at the end of a sentence and other such very useless kinds of rules. But how the language works in terms of what we do with discourse, what we do with structure, would not be something that you're particularly familiar with, okay? However, you're obligated at this point, if this is what you want to do, to gain that credible content knowledge, okay? So, some time ago, I recall the dread, please don't think that this did not happen to me. It totally happened to me just about 30 years ago. I had a very brief, what's called a CELTA certificate, which is a 6-week, 4-week, 5-week, I forget, Cambridge certificate, and it's, you know, you do it all, and then I went out to teach in Eastern Europe, and, you know, it's like, bye, good luck, you know, and when I got to Eastern Europe, I realized I didn't know what I was doing, and it was all very troubling, and, you know, then I decided I was going to do an MA in Applied Linguistics, and I came to University of Florida to do that. And they said, oh, you're an EFL teacher, great, you can teach the TOEFL classes. So there I was. Now, back in the day, the TOEFL was even more hideous than it is now. It was literally tiny, tiny little grammar issues that you had to deal with. So the problem wasn't the answers. I had the book and I had the answer book. The problem was that the students would say, but why? Because they wanted to understand in their own head, in their own system that they're developing, what's yes, what's, and could I answer why? Of course I couldn't answer why. I didn't know why. I mean, because that's the way we do it. So what I ended up doing was spending 2 or 3 hours a night on my one single 50-minute TOEFL class, literally just going through, okay, well, I know it's that one, but why isn't it that one? Why isn't it that one? For every question that was coming up, which is essentially how I taught myself grammar, should you decide that. Anyway, nothing that I had previously learned was of any help to me whatsoever. So after I was doing this for a year, I'm ready to kill myself, essentially. I learned a few lessons, which I will give to you. There is always a rule. I can guarantee you that. Every time a student says why, and you say, oh, it just is that way, you're lying to them. Because there's thousands and thousands of rules, but there's always a rule. Okay? So it's always that way because of some structural norm that, generally speaking, I had never heard of in my life. All right? My adult students, so by this now we're talking about people like Nana, Sandy, Jade, often knew more about this than I did because they came from a grammar translation environment. So they had spent their whole time learning about grammar. So I would say something, and this was really back in the day. Don't do this to yourselves, people really don't. They would ask me a question, I would think, I've got to say something. So I would say something, and then Nana would put up her hand and go, that's not what we learned. We learned that, you know, the agent was here because of this, 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 and this, and the reason you use for here and the reason you use since there is because, and I'd be like, oh, that sounds entirely reasonable. Crap. So, you know, so then how do you backtrack out of that, right? So I really quickly learned that you don't want to do that. What you want to do is get yourself a really good teacher's grammar book. So so in this country, people tend to use the grammar book. Has anyone seen the grammar book? Yeah. Yeah. Can anyone explain the grammar book? Sandy, do you?
I mean, I didn't use it.
So the grammar book is the size of Nebraska.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
of course, that's all
Yeah.
I know.
I was going to bring it and show you, but then I was like, I am not carting the grammar book in my backpack.
It's like the Bible.
It's a huge hard book, tome, and it has every single grammatical structure pretty much known to humankind in English, right? I think it was also by Diana Freeman, who's done pretty much everything in this film. She's one of the authors.
Yeah.
It's so popular that it's never been published in paperback. They've managed to keep it ongoing for years and years and years, even making people buy the hardback, because it has all the information about grammar you could ever want. So that's one possibility. And if you go and work for a good school, they should have access for you to at least one of these, the grammar book. If you want to look it up online, it's literally called The Grammar Book. The Grammar Book. And it's big and blue with yellow writing on it.
The third issue is red.
It could be red, yellow writing on it, and I don't know what color the writing is. But let's face it, most of us don't want to go around. So I got myself this thing, and I've had this, since about 1986. And there's a new version, but I love this one. Let's do it. You have it? It's called Practical English Usage by Michael Swan. And the reason it's so great is A, it's not the size of Nebraska, and B, it's organized for us. Okay? It is organized so you can find the very specific question that your student is going to ask you. For example, I just gave one. What's the difference between 4 or 5 years? I've been in America 4 or 5 years. I've been in America since 1985, says your student. How do I use the difference between the 4 and 6? You're thinking, yeah, okay, right. But let's say that's because you know that, right? Let's say you're Shelby and you're like, no, I mean that in the nicest possible way. Let's say you're me, right? As I was when I was you, Shelby, which was one time, right? Like I didn't know. Whoever taught me the difference between when I would use 4 and when I would use 6. So I do what Shelby is doing, which is sort of stand around going, well, maybe it's, So what I learned to say was, well, I'm not sure, but I'll look it up and I'll come back. What's great about this book is that's how it organizes the book. Okay, so what you do is you go to the back of the book and you look up there we go. For, since, from, ago. Perfect. So you're like, awesome, right? This is now going to explain, and it is all on 245. So you go to 245. And here it is, okay? For, since, from, ago, typical mistakes. This is typical mistakes by language learners. I know her for 10 years, right? We've been here since 3 months, okay? Then it gives you the rules for the difference between 4 and 6. So you don't have to go through a grammar book and say, let me look at, like the grammar book, and say, let me look up 4. Okay, that means that. Let me look up 6. The whole of the usage book is based on what your language learner errors are likely to be, and you can just look it up in the back of the book. So let's test it. Give me a language learner error. A grammatical form, typical based error, and we'll test like 4 and 6. Those of you that have some experience, or a language learner is obviously struggling with something. Yes, one part.
In, on, at.
In, on, at. Let's test out this sucker and see if we can find it. In, on, at. H. Oh, and looky here, and we didn't do this. One part and I did not do this, I promise you. In, on, at expressions of place. 88. Awesome. Here we go. At, on, in. Okay. So, it's a new, this is the old version, but it's still out there and it still does the exact same thing. Okay. You need this book. Yeah, it is. I tell you, for teachers and students, this is a fantastic book. I literally got through my teaching, novice teaching, before I knew anything about grammar at all, using this book. And I would literally say to the students, I don't know, but I'll look that up for you. And the next day, I'd come with either a nice piece of paper or a nice PowerPoint slide saying, here's the difference. So for those of you like me who are coming in as native speakers with nothing behind you, I really strongly recommend you get a usage book like this. And I think this one is now Swan and somebody. It's now got 2 authors. Now, can you have a look at that on Amazon for me? But I think it's now got 2 authors, but it's the exact same idea of a book.
Like the whole fast ordering method, right?
We're all on Amazon.
Oh, you're all on Amazon. That's good.
It's like the latest edition is the 3rd.
Oops.
It's
It's just by Swan.
3rd edition.
Okay. So, and it looks sort of pretty much. It's a not. And how much is it, Nana?
It's between $9 and $13.
Yeah, hardcover.
I'm telling you, people, it's a gift from God. It is a gift from God. Okay, I keep this on my desk still because I never know what a student is going to say. Such and such an issue, such and such an issue. There are literally thousands of rules. No one expects you to know those thousands of rules. Your job is to know where to go find those thousands of rules, right? Yes, Savannah.
As learners, how should we use this book?
Use it the exact same way. If one part was like, what is the difference between in, on, and at? Use it the exact same way. All I did was go into the what do you call that? Index. Thank you very much. Go into the index. See what I can find. In, on, at. It's right there. I mean, it's great. It's great.
Because I have this book and there is a lot of information, for example, for different tenses.
Yeah.
And I was eager to know about tenses. Do I need to just memorize and learn all of them, or I can, in case that I face some difficulties, should I refer to them? And in case I come up with a question, should I find answer for those questions?
Yeah. I mean, based on what we've been talking about before in terms of this idea of form, focus, meaning, and pragmatics, I think it's a mistake to go through a book like Betty Azar and say, now I'm doing the present, now I'm doing the present future, now I'm doing the past perfect, now I'm doing, because why would you even remember that, right? What's the point? So these books are best used exactly as we just used them, where you say, I can't remember whether it's in the bus or on the bus. I think it depends if you're in England or in America. I can't remember, So then you can use a book like this to give you that kind of information. It's full of tense stuff. The other great thing about it is full of the errors that students are typically going to make. So you can almost guarantee, way more than 50% of the time, the error that the student makes is one of the errors that they show in there. So there's not limitless amount of errors that your students will make.
And then they explain why that error.
Yep. And they explain why that error is. Well, because there's usually some structural issue that you've never thought of. So, for example, when Jade was, the 4 cents thing is about duration, but there's no reason why you would have ever thought of that as a native speaker. Why would you have done? You know, it's just not something that's likely to have happened to you.
And just a correction on the price. So check the website, because now suddenly I found the price is like $60 on one biblio.com, but on abooks.com it says it ranges between 9 and 13. So just a clarification.
And to be perfectly honest, I think, you know, I mean, I still use that first edition. I've never had, I don't know what's fabulous about the third edition.
There is a fourth edition.
Fourth edition.
And if I refresh, it's gonna be a better one.
Yeah, right. Now I'm beginning to feel like super old. There's a bit and a thing, and it's like, all right. But to be frank, I mean, you know, I've been working with that one since 1988. So, you know, I haven't actually felt the need to update. To be honest, my learners haven't changed that in terms of learner errors. It hasn't changed that much since 1988. So, you know, they're still making the same kind of errors with prepositions, with verbs, with, you know, so, you know, if you can find yourself a cheap copy that's or alternatively, if someone buys the last edition, do tell me what's so fabulous about the last edition. Yeah, for $60. Yeah. All right, so what you want to do is really, your job is to really monitor your students and to see what seems like important issues for form-focused instructors. This is in addition to whatever your textbook says, which may be a good textbook or may be a bad textbook, frankly. And then to have credible content knowledge, meaning if they're making a consistent, regular error. So we talked about the difference between errors and mistakes. So not in this class, maybe in SLA. So in SLA, we have a difference between errors and mistakes. So mistakes are something that anyone could make at any time completely randomly, including native speakers. Native speakers make mistakes all the time as they're speaking, you know, in terms of form or whatever. I just had one actually the other day. Someone started with a plural subject and then used a singular verb form, you know, I mean, yeah, but that's obviously not a systematic error. There's not a problem in that native speaker's understanding of the language system. And of course, that's also entirely different from something that's a dialectal thing, which is another thing, okay? But what you're looking for in students is errors, so systematic errors, errors that they keep making. It's clear that that part of the language system they're not real familiar with, or they need to get more familiar with it, okay? So one way I used to do this is to, let's say you're working on a language exercise from your textbook. This is just an example. And it becomes clear that your students are struggling with quantifying words, like some, a few, much, many, right? In English, this structure depends on whether you're describing count or non-count nouns, right? So also there are unsystematic differences, right? We have a word for 3 things, several, but we don't have a word for 5 things, right? We also know that quantifying words are different, always different across languages. Some languages have a quantifying word for everybody here in the group, but not me, right? But, and that's what that word means. You don't have to say everybody else in the group, but not me. That's what that quantifying word means. Some have quantifying words that mean 4 things or 6 things, or, you know, so you can almost guarantee that depending upon what language your learner comes from, it's A, going to have some differences from English, and B, they're going to have to understand the systematic gaps that English has as well, right? So let's say you find yourself with a 10-minute slot at the end of the lesson, and you think, you know what, I'm going to practice that and look at the rules with the students. So you can do something like this, have a game of tic-tac-toe, and work with your students. So let's split the room down the middle. We'll have Diego and Sam now, so the room goes down here. You're all A, and you're all big. Okay, so I guess I shouldn't write on that. Probably not going to go down well with the. So let's. I'm not going to rewrite them all, but basically, you've got. Okay, so this is going to be some. Oh, you can't see what I'm doing. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so let's start with A. So you have to, Team A, you have to pick one. If you get it right, you get that on your thing. So you can pick one. You pick. It's like tic-tac-toe. You know tic-tac-toe?
No.
Ah, tic-tac-toe. In English, in real English, we call it noughts and crosses. Do you guys have not have? Ah. So you know what? We're going to start with Team B because they've got some tic-tac-toe. So basically, what you do, guys, is you have to pick a place to start. Then your job is to try and get a line all right that way and that way. So the other team's job is to try and stop you. So if they chose those two and they got those two correct, you need to take that one because otherwise they're going to get a line.
Kind of three lines.
Yeah. Go that way or that way. All right, so Team B will start.
We'll start with a lot of.
Okay, so give me a sentence with a lot of. That has to be correct, by the way. Otherwise, you don't get it. I ate a lot of chocolate. That is indeed correct. So now, what happens? I don't know if you can see this, but they've got that middle square, right? So now you have to stop. Now they could go anywhere, right? Yeah. So what square would you guys like? Sorry, Sam and Az, they're all talking behind you. What square would you like?
A few.
A few, okay, go for it.
We have a few pens.
We have a few pens. Dance. Oh, sorry, no, you're noughts. You're noughts. I almost gave the correct. Okay, so that's you. You're a nought now. Yeah, yeah. So now they can't get a line going down that way. Okay. All right. Some. Go for it.
Some students in a class.
Say that again.
There are some students in a class.
There are some students in the class. Okay, good. That's fine. Cross on some. They can go down there, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A pair of.
A pair.
Sensible choice. Okay.
Now we have a pair of glasses.
Good. We have a pair of glasses. Good. I don't know how well you can see, but that's where you are now. Okay. Sorry, I don't know. Your crosses, you guys. So what are you taking?
Much.
Much. Okay, go for it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay. I'm going to take that, actually, because, yeah, okay, good. I think they might have tricked you. Oh, yeah. I think you've tricked them. I think they've tricked you.
Oh,
Yeah.
Many too much.
What do you want? Many. Okay.
we had many opportunities.
You had many opportunities. That's perfectly legitimate. So you now have one there.
Too much.
Okay.
They're gonna get it.
No, because we're no.
No. We're right.
This is our winning move.
Yep. This is your winning bid, Jay. Yeah.
It's the mentality.
Okay, but you do actually have to tell me one. Yeah. So give me a grammatically correct one.
I played this game too much. So.
I played this game too much. All right, and the winners are the crosses. Yay! Congratulations. All right. So you can see that it's sort of fun, right? And you would accompany this. In our case, I know everybody in this classroom knows the difference between several, many, much, and so on. But you would accompany this with some information, right? About many, several, much. But you don't have to cover all that information. You don't have to spend 10 minutes drilling it into your students, right? It's much more fun if you flip that. If you give them the information on a piece of paper and then say, we're now going to play a classic American game, and then have them work it out as they do it, right? And then you give them the information and they can keep that information. And if perhaps they get confused, it turns out the quantifying words and the differences between many, much, and so on are all in here. So, yeah. So that's just an example of how you can go ahead and do that. Yeah, tic-tac-toe, you guys call it tic-tac-toe. Just with CC, you know, TIC, TAC. But in England, we call it noughts and crosses because there are crosses and noughts. Yeah. So when I first came to this country, I didn't know what tic-tac-toe was. Yeah. You know, so of course before you do the game, you know, you've done some at least basic credible knowledge work on your own, right? So you need to familiarize yourself with basic rules and norms. You don't want to do a game like this and then someone says, oh, what's the difference between many and much? And you say, yeah, I don't know, but let's just play this game anyway, right? Yeah. So credible knowledge means that you decided to help your student with this area of form, so at least walk in the door knowing something. So that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to answer every single question, and that's fine, okay? So many used with countable, much used with non-countable, much most often used in questions, while lots is used in affirmative. So how much money versus a lot of money, right? There's no way as a native speaker I knew this. I mean, you can think about it, but it's sort of, you know, this you just have to pick up as you go on the way, or you look in the ground.
You think we're just used to phraseology, like phrases?
Absolutely, of course you are. Why would you even think about that? I wouldn't. If someone said to me, what's the difference between many and much? I would say, well, I've learned enough to know it's countable and uncountable, right? But if a student said, you know, it seems to me like it's structural too, that there's more muches in questions and more a lot ofs in affirmatives, I would say, well, I don't know. So that may be true. What you don't want to say is, well, that's not true, right? Because you don't know, okay? Your student may very well be right, and in this case, they are right. Some is most often used in affirmative, while any is most often used in negative. This is all information that's easily attainable, either from a book like that or from a textbook, if you look in a grammar textbook or so on. So then there's more sort of, you know, little bits and pieces. Don't use many here, don't use, you know, but you know, 90%, 95% of what your students are going to want from you is covered in these basic rules, okay? So, and slowly over time, the more you use them, the more you learn. The more you look them up, the more you remember. So, yeah. All right. So I want to just address again this idea of communicative language teaching. I can't tell you how often I've heard people say, well, we don't do any form-focused instruction because we're communicative language teachers. Okay. That's not what communicative language teaching means. Let me say that again. That's not what communicative language teaching means. Okay, communicative language teaching is based on 4 basic competencies, and the first of those basic competencies is grammatical competence. Okay, what it means is it's a crucial, in fact, it's a crucial component. Sorry, I'm moving here. It's a crucial component, particularly from intermediate to advanced. If you want to shove your learners up from low to mid intermediate, you've got to get them some form focused instruction. Okay. But what it doesn't do is focus like it does in GTM, right? What it does is take this idea of form, meaning, and use and try and cover those together in order that you not only know the structure, you know under what context you might want to use it, okay? So that's why it's important that you as a teacher have some credible content knowledge. Sadly, you can't say, I'm a communicative language teacher, thus I don't know any grammar, right? That's just not the way that's supposed to work. All right. On the other hand, no one should expect their teacher to be a human computer, right? I still tell my students, I'm not sure why that is. I'll go look that up, okay? So if a student said to me, for example, the previous thing about many and much, affirmatives and questions, which before I studied quantifiers, I had no idea. Before I had to teach quantifiers in the classroom. I mean, I knew about countable and uncountable, but I had no idea of the other thing. I would have said, I'm not sure, let me go look that up, right? Because there are so many thousands of rules, okay, that you can't be expected to know all of them. You can be expected to know the basic credible content knowledge. By credible content knowledge, we mean, you should be able to understand the word passive voice, past tense, present perfect, article, verb, adjective, right? And then you should know where to look to help you and your students work out the other stuff. What you shouldn't do is just sort of ignore it and hope it goes away. Yeah, that's not fair on your students, because you will, it will stop them from progressing all the way through. We know that. Okay. Any questions or comments? Yes, Sandy.
How would you address a student that has gone through English language learning for years with the grammar foundation method, and then comes to you and tells you that he's tired of studying English, not being able to communicate, and then he says, or she says, I don't want to study grammar anymore, I just want a conversation class. But they're no further than basic, A1 level. They're really fed up with grammar, they don't want to study grammar anymore, and they come to you and they tell you, I don't want to study grammar, I just want to communicate.
So my initial reaction would be that then you want to, clearly that student has in their own head a version of what grammar is. And it's the Bessie Azar version, right? And or the Vietnam teacher's version, okay? So sorry, shout out to Diana, I'm supposed to be, they can't always hear the questions that are asked. My apologies. What Sandy asked was, what do you do if you get a student who'd been brought up with GTM and then came to you and said, totally not interested in learning any more grammar, I've learned grammar for 6 years, and now I just want to do conversation. You listen to them and their grammar is absolutely dreadful. So you're like, crap, how am I going to deal with this? So the way I would deal with it is to not teach form-focused instruction in the way that they have had it taught before. Yeah. So one thing that I often do with learners that want to do more conversational work is have them transcribe, for example. So they can transcribe themselves, they can transcribe part of a TV program or something. Yeah, like literally transcribe. And then some authentic piece of material. Or download something like my case, the academic spoken English, which will transcribe for you, right? And then have them go through. And then you can work through grammar, you can work on the grammar through the discourse, right? So particularly when you can spot their errors, so they've made errors in their transcription, often form-focused errors, because they don't know what the correct thing is. But you're sort of bundling up the grammar with communication. So lots of games, communication games address grammar. directly, but with speaking. So, you know, I would literally say you've got to find another way. It's sort of like if you have a kid and they say they won't eat their vegetables. So what you do is you find a way to cook their vegetables inside a cookie, right? And they have a really nice sugar cookie with spinach in it, right? So that's what you do.
And until they get the proper concept.
Well, and you know, who knows if they ever, you know, I mean, one thing we know about second language learning is that some people are never going to get it. Yeah, and some people are never going to get it, and you know, if they're then it depends on what it is they need the communication for. You know, if you have someone who has appallingly bad grammar and they want to do English for academic purposes and write papers at the graduate level, they're screwed, right? So, but if they have appallingly bad grammar and they just want to chit chat, you know, yeah, then who cares, right? So, yeah, yeah. It's a good question because I know that. But it's really this idea of in your own mind saying form-focused instruction doesn't mean looking at a grammatical structure and practicing that sucker over and over and over again in no context for no specific reason, okay? Because that is almost guaranteed not to become a functional part of their working system, okay? Which is why I would say seminars don't start doing tons of exercises on tenses. What you're trying to do is make this thing a sort of working part of your system, which means that you have to work with it in a different way. Any other questions or comments before we? Okay. Did that all make sense? Mm-hmm. Let me say one more time. Communicative language teaching has a focus on grammar amongst several other foci. It is a necessary but not sufficient, but necessary condition, particularly to push language learning forward. All right. Discussion prompt. So what we're going to do for this discussion is practice one of Brown's suggested grammar techniques. So you'll remember from the book, he gave you like 5 pages of like, here's how you can do grammar other than Bettier's other way. You know, you can do charts, you can do games, you can do something like tic-tac-toe, you can do whatever you want, maps, objects. So what I want you to do is develop a short activity of your own that matches one of these types. So it's just you're going to replicate one of those types using grammatical form that you would like or find online that matches. State which technique you are demonstrating and why you chose it. Okay? So just as an example, I don't know if there's a good technique there. I can't remember all of the techniques. That would go with one posting where he said, okay, something that's sort of ticking me off is the difference between in, on, and out, right? So that has little 10-minute grammar activity written all over it. So he might be able to find a technique in these 5 pages that he thinks, well, that would be a good way to address that. Okay, so that's what you're doing. So pick a technique and a grammar issue that either you've had or your learners have had. Does that make sense? And last but not least, your first short essay is due on September 26th, which is not the end of this week, but the end of next week. So I'm giving you plenty of time to get this done. It's not due until the end of week 4. Today is only week 3. Before I get lots of panicky things, today is week 3. It's not due till week 4. So I'm giving you lots of time. Okay, so did we upload that yet, Shihan?
I did.
You did? Fantastic, yeah. So you're going to start by going to DocShare and downloading an article called Motivation and Motivating in the Foreign Language Classroom. Yes, that's what that's for. So it's what we call a foundational article, meaning Zoltán Donye is one of our leading scholars in individual differences. He is, if you ask for book, he writes the book chapters, he writes everything. He's been doing individual differences for ages. And this is one of his foundational articles where he really said, what are the differences between who's being successful and who's not being successful in a language classroom may have to do with this. Okay, so you're going to read this article that appeared in the Modern Language Journal, which is an excellent professional journal, particularly for those of you that are teaching foreign languages. But it's great. I mean, we all read Modern Language Journal. So you're going to respond to its content in a short essay, 600 to 700 words long, and your response should take the form of a summary and a final discussion. Okay? Use APA citation conventions to quote from the article, and at the top, this is a mistake, obviously. That should be in there, and that gap shouldn't be there. This should be at the top of your paper, the bibliographic citation. Yeah. So at the top of your paper, you're just going to put the bibliographic citation, which I've given you right here. This has changed since I've uploaded it. This should actually not have a gap, and this should be 3 in there, which is the. Now, I don't know where people try not to get upset about this. APA just is a certain way of doing it. It's not, you don't have to memorize any of it or anything, you just have to do it that way. So if you go to the Purdue website, you will find the OWL English, which is the one that we typically use. You can use the APA, I think it's like 6th edition now, 7th edition or something. Yeah, and that's at the library, but this is pretty good. I mean, it's pretty hard to get confused. And really what I'm interested in, I'm not interested in a summary page, an abstract and all that. What I'm interested in is literally citation conventions and bibliography style, right? So there's a certain way in which you cite work. You put, for example, Donye, 1994, suggests that, and the 1994 has parentheses around it, and, so that's what I'm interested in, okay? That when you write and that when you quote, you understand how you quote. If it's more than 3 lines long, you block quote it away from the rest of it. You don't use half mini quotes where you say, Donye said, quote, this was a really lovely, unquote, day trip that we went on, like some weird half quote that you do where instead of rewriting it, you just sort of do some weird half quoting when you should in fact have rewritten it. If you quote specifically, you have to have a page number. If it's not a specific quote, you don't have a page number. Okay, this is the kind of thing I'm looking for. It's all in that site. But so as you go through and you think, I want to quote this. What are the citation conventions for quoting this? You just look at the OWL conventions. Now, alternative way of doing it is taking a journal like TESOL Quarterly, which is our leading foundational journal in the field, which you can get free at the library, and just copy what they do, okay? TESOL Quarterly is APA, okay? So if you're not sure what they do, you can use that as a sort of reference sheet, as you go through and look at how they've written things, you can write it in a similar style, okay? Okay, is that your syllabus? Sorry, because I meant to bring mine and I did. Thanks, Nana. Remember at the back of your syllabus, I put a rubric for these short essays, okay? So there's absolutely no surprise about how this is going to be graded, all right? You're graded on content, structure, timeliness, citation, and forget the bit that says element of the lesson plan. You've not got a lesson plan, but everything else is. So content, structure, timeliness, citations, accuracy. Accuracy meaning academic English. Okay. Remember also that we have a writing lab on campus, and those of you who are online, you can access that writing lab online. So just go to TAMAC website and you'll find the access information for the online. So you can actually work with the tutor online, not just for those of you who are face to face. You can just take your short essay in there and get them to have a look and help you out if you've got anything you're confused by. That said, they are not necessarily fabulous with APA. So you probably wouldn't want to rely on them because they do MLA and they're often not entirely sure I've discovered what the difference. So APA, you're on your own. You can just use the OWL website, or the TESOL quarterly thing. But if you want someone to just sort of check your overall structure and everything else, then they'll help you out. Any other questions anyone can think of?
So about the article, like about the content.
Yeah.
So we should just summarize, or we have to just say what point do we think?
Well, so the summary and your point that you think will be in your final discussion.
So like which part we find interesting?
Well, whatever it is in the final discussion that you find interesting. Yeah. So you'll do a summary, a general summary, and then the last part will be a sort of position point, so you might say, overall, this is helpful because, it gives this information, it gives that information. We might say, overall, well, I wouldn't say overall it wasn't very helpful. You can say the bits that I found particularly because it's Zoltan Donier. So if you're not finding that helpful, then you probably shouldn't be in this class. So, but you can say, the bit I found particularly helpful was, because okay. But don't suddenly get into journal writing. Okay, it's still academic writing. You can still give your opinion, but it shouldn't suddenly turn into, oh yeah, I thought that bit was great because yesterday in my classroom, my student said, that it's still got to retain. You've got to learn how to give your opinion in an academic style. That's essentially what this is about. I only need 600 to 700 words to help you do that. Okay, that's why I'm not asking you to do thousands and thousands of words. I'm asking you 3 times to do 600 to 700 words, and by the end of that 3rd time, you'll know what APA academic style is. Okay, because you'll have gone through it. By the 3rd time, it will be golden. Okay, and all I need to do that is 600 to 700 words each.
So is it fair to say the essay will be like 5 paragraphs or so?
I don't remember how many words.
About 250.
250 a page, right? Yes, it's about 3 to 4 pages, something like that.
From 1 paragraph, maybe it's like 300.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a page is about 200, 250 words. Yeah. So you're looking at about. Is that right?
No, 1 paragraph is about 250 words.
Oh. Wow. That's really small.
2.5, 3 paragraphs.
Oh, okay. All right. Great. Okay. That's all I need.
Less than a page.
I might up it for the other 2. We'll see. We'll see how you guys do. Yeah. But remember, it's going to be the grading is picky. Okay. That's why it's just a short amount. If you don't put like the page and the quote number, that's bad, right? So the grading is deliberately picky. Okay. Yeah. Questions? All right, guys. Thank you so much, and thank you for being so great to our visiting lecturer.
We hope that you guys too enjoyed our visiting lecturer, and with these 2 sections of you will now be working with me online for the rest of the week, so that's great. Thanks very much. Oh, we have one more question.
To have that presentation, PowerPoint presentation.
So Nana's asking if she can have your PowerPoint presentation. Of course, says Dr. Lee. That will be uploaded by Shihun into all the sessions this week. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.